You know, usually when we talk about our favorite action movies or epic stories, there is this underlying expectation of the lone wolf.
Right, the solitary powerhouse.
Exactly. Picture the classic 1980s action hero, covered in mud, holding a weapon half the size of his body.
Taking on an entire army in the jungle completely by himself.
Yeah, and the audience points at the screen and says, there he is, the hero. One guy against the world.
It is a very clean, almost binary way of looking at power. I mean, we find deep comfort in the idea that our heroes are these singular, uniquely unstoppable forces of nature.
Because it's easy, right?
Exactly. We want the problems they face to be solvable simply by hitting things really, really hard. Removes all the complexity from conflict. If the villain is strong, well, the hero just needs to be stronger.
Right. But what if that original action hero wasn't a lone wolf at all? Because today we are stepping into the world of Hellenistic literature, specifically this incredibly rich ancient Greek epic, and suddenly that lone wolf model is entirely shattered.
Completely dismantled.
Yeah, we're looking at a heroic landscape that feels, honestly, remarkably modern. It is collaborative, it is specialized, it's about a team.
We are witnessing this monumental paradigm shift in ancient storytelling. The literature really reflects a cultural realization that you're watching the death of the solitary brute force hero and the birth of the cooperative specialized team.
Like a structural shift in how they saw the world.
Exactly. The Hellenistic world was realizing that complex problems, they require complex interlocking solutions.
So to you, our listener, diving in with us today, I am so glad you're here because the mission for this deep dive is to unpack a massive, multi-layered, scholarly dossier analyzing books 1 and 2 of Apollonius of Rhodes' Argonautica.
Yes, the legendary tale of Jason and the Argonauts.
And we aren't just looking at a basic plot summary of a boat trip.
No, not at all. Our sources for today are extensive. We're synthesizing a comprehensive literary analysis of the text, a rigorous linguistic breakdown of the actual discourse and grammar Apollonius uses, plus intertextual comparisons tracing how this epic talks back to older writers.
Like Homer and Hesiod.
Right. And then there's a profound theological critique.
And that theological critique is where this journey goes into absolute overdrive, because our sources compare this pagan Greek epic to the Old and New Testaments, culminating in how the early church fathers literally hijacked the mythology of the Argo for Christian theology.
It's a fascinating cross-cultural dialogue.
It really is. This isn't just a dusty myth about a magical golden sheepskin. It is a story about a massive cultural shift. And I promise you, by the end of this deep dive, you will see how an ancient Greek sea voyage perfectly mirrors our modern struggles with anxiety, teamwork, and, the deeply human desire to somehow control the uncontrollable.
Absolutely.
So let's get into the narrative catalyst. Where does a massive world-spanning epic like this actually begin?
Well, structurally, the epic starts exactly how you would expect a classical poem to begin, with a formal invocation to the god Apollo and the Muses.
Standard epic stuff.
Right. But the actual engine of the plot, the force that pushes this ship into the water, is human anxiety. Specifically, the paralyzing anxiety of King Peleus.
Okay, so we have this king sitting on the throne of Iolcus, and he is just absolutely terrified of losing his power.
Peleus has received a prophecy warning him that a one-sandaled man is going to bring about his doom. This sets up one of the most enduring themes, not just in this epic, but I mean in all of human literature.
Which is?
The mortal evasion of divine destiny. Peleus is using every ounce of his political and institutional power to try and outsmart fate.
Which, for anyone who has ever read a single Greek myth, is basically signing your own death warrant. I mean, the gods do not appreciate mortals trying to find loopholes in their prophecies.
They certainly do not. And Peleus compounds his impending doom by neglecting the goddess Hera in his religious sacrifices. He throws this massive banquet, and who shows up?
Let me guess. The one-sandaled man.
Exactly. Jason arrives. And crucially, Jason is missing a sandal. He lost it while struggling to carry an old woman across the muddy, treacherous river Anaurus.
Oh, wait. The old woman was a god in disguise, right?
Yes. Unbeknownst to Jason, the woman was actually Hera in disguise, testing him.
So the famous one-sandaled man has arrived, and he already has the favor of the queen of the gods. Peleus is doomed.
Basically, yeah. When Peleus sees that barefoot, he panics internally. But he cannot just execute Jason in front of everyone.
Why not? He's the king.
Because that would violate the sacred laws of hospitality, which would invite immediate divine wrath. You don't just murder guests at a banquet.
Ah, right. So he has to be sneaky about it.
Exactly. Instead, he devises this perilous, seemingly impossible maritime quest. He commands Jason to travel to the distant barbaric land of Colchis to retrieve the Golden Fleece.
But he doesn't actually want the fleece, does he? I mean, he just wants Jason dead.
Right. The quest is specifically designed as a death sentence. At the very least, he expects permanent exile. Peleus believes that by sending the problem across the known world, he has successfully broken the prophecy.
So the entire inciting incident for this epic adventure is just a corrupt king trying to save his own skin.
That's the catalyst, yes.
But to pull off this impossible mission, Jason doesn't just grab a sword, pack a lunch, and start walking. We get this massive section in Book 1 called the Catalogue of Heroes. Our sources emphasize that Apollonius spends an enormous amount of time just listing the crew members.
The Catalogue of Heroes is a really fascinating piece of literature because it's a direct structural adaptation of Homer's famous Catalogue of Ships from the Iliad.
Oh, I remember that from school.
Right. But Apollonius transforms the function of the catalog completely.
Yeah, because if I am remembering Homer correctly, his catalog is basically a military ledger. It is line after line of this king brought 50 ships, that king brought 100 ships.
Exactly. It's all about overwhelming military volume and identical foot soldiers.
But reading Apollonius's catalog in our sources felt entirely different. It felt like watching the opening sequence of an Ocean's 11 heist movie.
That is a great comparison.
Or like watching a modern tech startup assemble its founding team. You know?
That analogy captures the spirit of the text beautifully. You don't just hire 100 guys with identical spears, and you don't hire one giant guy with a club.
Right.
The Hellenistic era was a time of sprawling empires, complicated bureaucracies, and diverse societies following the conquest of Alexander the Great. The literature reflects a worldview realizing that you cannot just smash your way through this new world.
You need the hacker, the getaway driver, the smooth talker. You need
Right.
specialists.
And that is exactly what Jason recruits. Instead of a massive, faceless army, he builds a diverse crew with highly specialized, non-overlapping talents.
Like who?
Well, you have Orpheus, whose magical divine music isn't just for entertainment. It is a critical technological tool needed to set the synchronized rhythm for the rowers.
Oh, wow.
And later, it is the only thing that saves them from the legal song of the sirens.
So music as an actual survival mechanism. That's wild. Who else?
Then you have Tethys, the master navigator. He understands the currents, he can read the stars, and he knows how to steer the ship in uncharted waters. You also have Calais and Zetes, known as the Boreads.
Wait, are those the guys who literally possess wings and can fly?
Yes, exactly.
Having a couple of guys with wings on a boat seems incredibly useful. I mean, just structurally speaking. But thinking about this elite team of specialists, I have to ask about the CEO.
You mean Jason?
Yeah. Who is leading this startup, because the descriptions of Jason in these sources paint a picture of a guy who is definitely not your typical fearless leader. I mean, he is anxious, he is emotionally vulnerable.
Very much so.
Our sources point out that he spends an uncomfortable amount of time weeping.
Jason is deliberately characterized in stark contrast to traditional individualistic epic heroes like Achilles or Odysseus. Apollonius gives us a protagonist who exhibits profound emotional vulnerability.
Like, he literally cries.
Yes. When Jason leaves his homeland, he breaks down and cries. When the ship faces a storm, he broods helplessly.
I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of an ancient Greek reader, or even just the crew on that ship. Wouldn't Jason just look pathetic? I mean, how did Apollonius convince his audience that a crying administrator is a better hero than a warrior?
It is a jarring shift, for sure.
Especially since Heracles is literally standing right there on the beach. Was Heracles the obvious choice for a dangerous, impossible mission? The guy is basically a walking nuclear deterrent.
The crew actually shares your exact sentiment.
Really?
Yes. Apollonius anticipates that reaction from the audience and addresses it directly in the narrative. Before they even set sail, the crew holds a democratic vote, and they overwhelmingly elect Heracles to be their captain.
Because obviously you pick the guy who can punch a mountain.
Right. They recognize his sheer, overwhelming martial strength as the traditional marker of leadership.
But he doesn't take the job.
No. Heracles flatly refuses the position. He declines the leadership and insists that Jason lead the expedition.
Wait, why?
His reasoning is that Jason is the one who organized the logistics, gathered the crew, and liaised with the royal court.
Okay, so he recognizes the need for an administrator.
Heracles seems to intuitively grasp that this journey requires diplomatic and communal management. It requires a leader who can build consensus, manage divergent personalities, and negotiate with foreign kings.
rather than a warlord who just rules by sheer martial dominance.
Exactly. Jason's leadership model is rooted in consensus. The very fact that he asks the crew to elect their bravest leader shows a level of humility and reliance on the collective that would be entirely foreign, perhaps even offensive, to a Homeric hero like Achilles.
Huh. But keeping Heracles on the boat is still a massive narrative problem, isn't it? I mean, our sources explicitly mention that Heracles is almost too strong for this new Hellenistic world.
He absolutely is.
If you have a guy who can rip the vault door off its hinges, you don't really need the rest of the heist crew.
Right. Heracles stands as an intertextual embodiment of the older, archaic, heroic archetype. He represents the Hesiodic, brute force past. And Apollonius uses him to show how disruptive that kind of limitless individualistic power is to a cooperative team.
Like the scene where he decides to row the ship all by himself. I love that part.
It's a perfect example.
Mm-hmm.
His physical strength breaks the mechanics of the journey. In one scene, he literally pulls the entire massive ship forward through the water with his rowing alone, completely overpowering the rest of the crew.
Just flexing on everyone.
Yeah. And later, when his oar breaks, he just walks onto the shore, finds a massive pine tree, uproots it with his bare hands, and fashions it into a new oar.
Which is awesome, but it breaks the rules of the genre.
Exactly. His presence threatens to overshadow the cooperative nature of the voyage. Structurally, Apollonius has to remove him from the narrative for the team to function.
So how does he get rid of him?
The author accomplishes this during a stopover in Mysia. Heracles has a beloved young companion named Hylas. Hylas goes to a spring to fetch water and is abducted by a water nymph who basically falls in love with his beauty.
Oh, no.
When Heracles realizes Hylas is missing, he completely abandons the mission.
He goes full lone wolf action hero, right? Just tearing up the countryside looking for his friend.
He enters this frantic, violent, single-minded search, completely ignoring the ship and the crew. And in the ensuing panic and confusion, the Argos set sail, and Heracles is accidentally left behind.
Wait, accidentally? How does the crew react?
They are initially furious and panicked, ready to turn around.
Because they think they just lost their nuclear deterrent.
Exactly. But then, the sea god Glaucus rises from the waves and delivers a divine revelation. He tells the crew that Heracles is not meant to go to Colchis. Heracles is fated to fulfill his own individual, solitary labors for King Eurystheus.
So his departure is an absolute structural necessity.
It is. It clears the narrative stage. It forces Jason's collaborative, skill-based heroism to shine. It essentially signals to the reader that you cannot just smash your way through the complexities of this new world. You need diplomacy. You need navigation. You need the team.
Man, that is so clever. So we see the shift in the plot and the characters, but our sources point out something even more fascinating. This shift from the lone wolf to the anxious, cooperative leader is literally baked into the grammar of the text.
Yes, the linguistic analysis.
Let's look at the actual words on the page, because how does an author use syntax to enforce a worldview?
The linguistic breakdown in our dossier focuses on something called discourse architecture.
Discourse architecture.
Okay, this is the study of how information flows in a sentence, and how the arrangement of clauses impacts the psychological experience of the reader. Apollonius uses syntax to make the reader feel the crushing weight of destiny and the vastness of the alien world.
Break that down for me. How do you use grammar to make someone feel destiny? I'm imagining high school English class, trying to figure out how a verb makes me feel fatalistic.
It has to do with how the author introduces scenes and actions. Across books 1 and 2, Apollonius systematically places geographic transitions, physical boundaries, and raw locations at the absolute beginning of his clauses.
Okay, give me an example.
In English, we might naturally say, Jason confidently sailed his ship to the dangerous shores of Lemnos. The human action comes first.
All right, the human is the subject driving the sentence.
But in the Argonautica, the text routinely front-loads the locations. The syntax is structured closer to the jagged, unyielding shores of Lemnos, the ship arrived, or into the muddy, churning depths of the river Norris, the sandal sank.
Oh, wow. So the geography hits you before the people do.
Exactly. By front-loading the spatial contexts, Apollonius forces the reader to mentally prioritize the geography over the human action.
That makes so much sense.
Geography becomes a dominant, looming character in the story. It makes the mortal characters feel small, reactive, and subordinate to the vast, dangerous environment they're trying to cross.
That is brilliant. It's like the environment is an active, hostile force dictating the terms of the adventure, and the humans are just reacting to it. And our sources also mention the text uses different types of verbs depending on who is on screen.
Yes, the physical versus the internal.
Right.
The text uses grammar to build two radically different spheres of reality. When the narrative focuses on traditional archaic figures like Heracles or the savage King Amycus, who we will discuss shortly, the clauses are heavily dominated by verbs of physical force, bodily movement, and external impact.
Like crushing, striking, uprooting, shattering, pure action verbs.
Right. But when the focus shifts to Jason, the nature of the grammatical description changes entirely.
How so?
The text systematically minimizes aggressive physical deeds. Instead, Jason's clauses are built around internal psychological states, emotional vulnerability, shared verbal exchanges, and cooperative dialogue.
So less punching, more talking.
Exactly. Jason is frequently the subject of verbs like pondered, wept, gathered, or spoke.
So the author is essentially playing Jedi mind tricks on the reader. He is subtly training us, sentence by sentence, to associate the archaic world with blunt force and the new Hellenistic world with internal reflection and communication.
That is a perfect way to summarize it.
But wait, what about the gods? How does the grammar handle divine prophecy? Because the dossier spends a lot of time on the language of absolute certainty.
This grammatical choice directly impacts how we view the human plotting in this story. When prophecies are delivered, whether by the human seers like Idmon and Mopsus or divine figures like Locus, the text employs commanding, unyielding language.
Meaning there's no wiggle room.
None. There are no modal verbs of possibility. It's never, this might happen, or there's a chance you could die. The Greek syntax conveys absolute, ironclad certainty. It leaves absolutely no room for human doubt or alternative outcomes.
Wow.
The universe, from the divine perspective, is a rigid, predetermined architecture.
How does experiencing that absolute certainty from the gods affect the listener's view of King Peleus, the guy who is sitting at home trying to outsmart the prophecy?
It renders Peleus completely foolish,
Yeah.
almost pathetic, really. When mortal plans are described, like Peleus scheming in his palace to send Jason away, the language shifts to become highly speculative, shaded with evaluation, hope, and contingency.
Like, if he sends him to Colchis, perhaps he will die at sea.
Yes.
So the reader feels the rigid weight of divine grammar and then watches a human use flimsy, speculative grammar to try and beat it.
It highlights the profound blindness of fallen, mortal humanity. Peleus's schemes aren't just evil. They are structurally useless. He is trying to build a sandcastle to hold back a tidal wave, and the very grammar of the text tells the reader that the wave has already crashed.
Man, that is just incredible writing. Okay, so having established this new cooperative model and how the author uses grammar to make us feel the weight of the environment and fate, let's look at the actual obstacles the crew faces.
The trials.
Because a team is only as good as the trials that test its cohesion, right? And these encounters happen on the absolute edge of the known world, dealing with savagery, temptation, and deep symbolism. Let's start with the island of Lemnos.
The Argonauts arrive at the island of Lemnos, and they discover an entirely female society.
Which is already unusual.
Very. And the backstory is brutal. Under a curse from the goddess Aphrodite, the Lemnian women were rejected by their husbands, who favored captive Thracian women.
Okay.
In response to this betrayal, the Lemnian women orchestrated a mass slaughter, murdering all their male relatives in a single night.
They completely eradicated the patriarchy in one night. Just wiped it out.
And in doing so, they completely reversed traditional ancient Greek gender roles. They now wear martial armor, they perform the heavy agricultural labor, and they rule themselves autonomously under their queen, Hypsipyle.
Now, when the Argonauts show up, you'd think there would be a massive battle, right? Heavily armed men meet heavily armed women who hate men, but Queen Hypsipyle and her advisors strategically decide to welcome these heroes into the city.
Yes, they want protection, and, frankly, they want to repopulate their island to ensure their society survives.
And the Argonauts just go along with it.
They immediately succumb to the invitation. They are drawn into the city, bathed, fed, and seduced by domestic and sensual pleasures. The heroic quest is indefinitely delayed as the men settle into comfortable lives with the Lemnian women.
I have to pause here. When I was reading about this episode in the dossier, it sounded exactly like a classic Odyssey trope.
In what way?
You know, Odysseus getting stuck on an island with Circe or Calypso being delayed by a beautiful magical woman. Is Apollonius just lazily copying Homer's homework here?
The intertextual analysis in our dossier answers that critique beautifully, actually. Apollonius is definitely invoking Homer, But he is fundamentally complicating the trope.
How so?
It evokes the existential threat of abandoning heroic renown, what the Greeks called kleos, for stationary domestic comfort.
Hmm.
But Apollonius introduces this radical gender reversal.
Right, because Circe was just one isolated witch living in the woods. This is an entire functioning society.
Exactly. It transforms a standard, epic monster obstacle into a complex exploration of societal boundaries and gender dynamics. These women aren't just magical seductresses. They are a geopolitical entity that has violently rejected the traditional Hellenic order.
Wow.
And the mechanism of the Argonauts' rescue from this domestic trap is incredibly telling about the limits of Jason's leadership.
Let me guess. Jason doesn't save them.
No, he doesn't. Heracles does.
Well, wait, I thought he was left behind.
This happens before he's left behind in Mysia. During the Lemnian interlude, Heracles is still on the crew, and crucially, he refused to go into the city. He stayed behind at the ship with a few companions.
Ah, of course he did.
When he sees the crew abandoning the mission, he marches into the city and delivers a stern, scathing, hyper-masculine intervention. He scolds the men back to their duty, shaming them for abandoning their glory to play house with foreign women.
Which is fascinating because it shows that while the new cooperative emotional model of Jason is necessary to navigate the politics of the journey, the old, rigid, martial discipline of Heracles is still occasionally required to keep the crew from completely dissolving into complacency.
It highlights the persistent narrative tension. The Hellenistic world prized civilization and comfort, but civilization can easily slip into inertia. Sometimes you need the archaic brute to remind you that there is still work to be done.
So they finally tear themselves away from Lemnos, thanks to Heracles, and we get to a part of Book 1 that is purely visual and symbolic. Our sources spend pages analyzing Jason's purple cloak.
Yes, this is a classic example of ekphrasis.
Ekphrasis, what is that?
It's a prolonged, detailed literary description of a physical work of art. Homer famously used this device to describe the intricate carvings on the shield of Achilles, which mapped out the entire cosmos and human society.
Right.
Apollonius adapts this device, giving Jason a magnificent double-folding purple cloak woven by the goddess Athena herself.
What is so important about a piece of clothing? I mean, what is actually woven into it?
The cloak contains several highly symbolic micro-narratives that act as interpretive keys for Jason's own overarching quest.
Okay, give me an example.
For instance, one vignette shows the Cyclops forging Zeus's thunderbolts. This represents divine order, craftsmanship, and technological creation.
Another vignette shows twins building a city, right?
Yes, the twins Amphion and Zethus building the walls of Thebes. But crucially, Zethus is depicted using brute physical toil, straining to lift heavy stones on his back.
It's the old way.
Right. Amphion, however, uses the civilizing, magical power of his golden lyre to make the stones move into place on their own.
Wow. So right there, woven into the fabric on his back, Jason is wearing a symbol declaring that music, intellect, and skill, the new Hellenistic way, are equal to or greater than raw physical labor.
Exactly.
It perfectly mirrors having Orpheus on the ship instead of just relying on Heracles.
It reinforces the entire thesis of the epic. Another scene on the cloak shows Pelops winning his bride Hippodamia through a dangerous, high-stakes chariot race, which foreshadows Jason's impending pursuit of Medea and the fleece through lethal trials.
It's all connected.
And finally, the cloak depicts Phrixus listening to the speaking ram that originally carried the Golden Fleece, grounding Jason's current quest in its foundational mythological history.
So the cloak is basically a wearable trailer for the themes of the epic. It encapsulates fate, craft, and heroic legacy. That neatly wraps up the major themes of Book 1. But Book 2 is where things get really violent.
Very much so.
This is where the civilized Hellenistic world violently collides with the old savage world. The crew encounters King Amycus.
The Argonauts land in the territory of the Bebrycians, ruled by King Amycus. And Amycus represents everything the Argonauts have supposedly left behind. He's the embodiment of savage, anti-hospitable, unchecked brutality.
He sounds lovely.
He enforces a terrifying law on his shores. He forces all foreign travelers who land there into deadly boxing matches.
And he is never lost. Our sources mention he is visually compared to an earthborn monster.
The text compares him to Typhoeus, the monstrous, chaotic being from Hesiod's Theogony. Amycus invokes the primordial, lawless chaos that existed before Zeus established cosmic order and justice.
So he's not exactly fighting fair.
Not at all. Amycus doesn't fight with strategy, rules, or technique. He fights with raw, crushing, chaotic mass.
Now, when the challenge is issued, it isn't Jason, the anxious administrator, who steps up, and it isn't Heracles, because he is gone. It is Polydeuces.
Polydeuces is one of the heavenly twins, the Dioscuri. The text goes to great lengths to describe him in stark visual and moral contrast to the monstrous Amycus.
How so?
While Amycus is described as dark, heavy, and chaotic, Polydeuces is described as a beautiful, shining star.
Okay, so how does the actual fight play out? Because it isn't just two guys swinging wildly at each other, right?
No, Amycus rushes forward like a chaotic tidal wave, relying entirely on heavy, blind, looping blows designed to crush his opponent instantly. He tries to overwhelm Polydeuces with sheer volume and mass.
But Polydeuces doesn't just try to punch harder. He doesn't meet force with force.
Exactly. Polydeuces utilizes superior defensive agility. He employs precise footwork, he calculates his timing perfectly, he evades Amycus's clumsy rushes, lets the giant tire himself out by swinging at the air, and then, finding the perfect opening, delivers a precise, devastating strike that shatters Amycus's skull.
Wow, it is the ultimate victory of technique over muscle.
It serves as an allegory for the triumph of Hellenistic civilization itself. Polydeuces' victory symbolizes how Greek intelligence, refined technique, and measured athletic training can overcome raw, unchecked, earth-born violence.
It's basically a polemical statement by the author.
Right. The civilized, disciplined mind will always defeat the savage, lawless fist.
And the author embeds this moral judgment right into the language of the fight. The sources call it polarized moral evaluation.
The narrator deliberately embeds intense emotional coloring into the descriptions of the two fighters. Amycus is constantly framed with words evoking revulsion, arrogance, and monstrosity.
Polydeuces.
Polydeuces is framed with words denoting radiant light, discipline, and divine favor. The text doesn't just report a sporting event, It actively steers the audience's moral alignment toward the ideals of intellectual skill and cosmic order.
Okay, beating up a local bully with good footwork is impressive. But after defeating the savage king, the crew faces an obstacle that absolutely cannot be outsmarted in a boxing ring.
The physical boundaries of the world.
Right. They reach the geographical boundary between the known, familiar Mediterranean world and the alien, terrifying expanse of the Black Sea. This brings us to the ultimate threshold, the clashing rocks, the Symplegades.
But before they can navigate this impossible geographical nightmare, they meet another deeply tragic figure on the shoreline, King Phineus.
Phineus is a seer, a man who can see the future. But his gift has become a horrific curse. He's frail, blind, and constantly tormented by harpies.
The harpies are these monstrous, screeching bird women sent by Zeus. Every time Phineus tries to eat a meal to sustain his frail body, the harpies swoop down from the sky, snatch the food from his hands, and defile whatever is left, leaving a putrid stench.
That is disgusting.
He is slowly starving to death in agony.
But wait, if Zeus is the one who gave Phineus the gift of prophecy in the first place, why is he torturing him so brutally for using it?
Because Phineus used his prophetic gifts to reveal the divine will too clearly and completely to mortal men.
Oh.
Zeus demands that mortal knowledge remain incomplete and fragmented. The Greek cosmic framework requires humanity to remain structurally dependent on the gods, constantly guessing, offering sacrifices, and living in a state of uncertainty. Phineus gave away too many cosmic secrets. He pulled back the curtain too far.
It reminds me of Prometheus being tortured for giving humanity the technology of fire, but here the forbidding technology is pure information. So the Argonauts arrive, and remember those specialists we talked about, Calais and Zetes, the brothers with wings. They take to the sky, chase the harpies far away, and finally save the starving prophet.
And in deep gratitude for his deliverance, Phineus gives Jason the precise geographic and tactical blueprint they need to survive the Symplegades.
The clashing rocks.
Right. These are two massive floating cliffs that violently smash together, crushing any ship or creature attempting to pass between them.
Phineus gives them what our sources call the dove test.
He instructs the crew to take a dove and release it into the treacherous gap between the clashing rocks. If the rocks crush the bird, it means the gods have sealed their fate. They must turn back, for the quest is doomed.
But if it survives...
If the dove makes it through the gap, they must immediately row with every ounce of strength they possess.
I want to focus on the sensory details here, because Apollonius writes this scene like a horror movie. The water is violently churning, the sound of the rocks grinding against each other is deafening, echoing like thunder.
It's terrifying.
They release the dove, it flies into the gorge, the massive rocks crash together with terrifying speed, and the dove barely escapes, losing only its tail feathers to the crushing stone.
The survival of the dove provides the structural confirmation they need. The tactical prudence of the test has worked. Now comes the requirement for extreme human physical stamina.
Because they have to get the boat through.
Right. The rowers strain against a monstrous churning wave, pulling their oars until they bend, fighting against the chaotic pull of the sea.
I kept thinking of a modern space launch when I read this section.
How so?
Well, surviving this threshold requires this perfect, delicate convergence of different elements. You have the brilliant engineering and the highly specialized crew, that's the Argonauts.
Yeah.
You have the computer simulations and the mathematical certainty that the window is open, that's the dove test.
Right.
But at the exact moment of launch, when the engines ignite, you are still utterly at the mercy of physics and the vastness of the universe.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. Because human skill, tactical prudence, and physical stamina alone are still not enough to survive the simple gates. At the very last possible second, as the rocks are rebounding to crush the wooden hull of the Argo, they receive direct, physical, divine intervention.
The goddess Athena actually shows up.
She descends from the sky, plants her feet on a nearby rock, and physically shoves the ship forward through the gap with her hand.
Wait, she just literally pushes the boat out of the way of the rocks?
Yes. The ship escapes into the Black Sea, losing only the very tip of its carved wooden stern ornament, perfectly mirroring the dove losing its tail feathers.
Wow.
This climactic moment cements the Hellenistic worldview. Human specialization, intelligence, and strategy are absolutely essential, but ultimate success still demands a delicate balance between mortal effort and direct divine alignment. You cannot survive the ultimate threshold of life entirely on your own.
Which is a profound realization for an ancient audience. But here is where this deep dive takes a massive, fascinating turn. Because our scholarly dossier doesn't just stop at literary analysis of Greek themes.
No, it zooms out.
It zooms way out to look at how this pagan epic sits alongside the most influential texts of the ancient world, the Bible.
And before we dive into these theological comparisons, we need to explicitly state our methodology. When we look at how the Argonautica compares to the Old and New Testaments, and later to the early church fathers, our goal is not to endorse one theology over another.
Right, nor are we entering into modern religious debates.
We are impartially reporting on the comparative synthesis provided in our source material. We are simply unpacking the ideas and structural parallels that the scholars in our dossier have identified.
Absolutely. And the parallels they identify are undeniably striking. I mean, the imagery we just discussed, a crew navigating a deadly, chaotic, aquatic threshold by releasing a dove from a wooden vessel. It feels incredibly familiar, doesn't it?
Very familiar.
If you grew up in the church or even just know basic cultural Sunday school stories, you hear man on a boat releases a dove to survive a watery threshold, and your brain immediately goes to Noah's Ark. Let's pull out the theological analysis and look at these Old Testament echoes.
The Old Testament critique in our dossier meticulously maps how Apollonius's literary world mirrors, adapts, or sharply diverges from the structural paradigms found in the Hebrew Scriptures. Let's start with the primary antagonist, King Pelias.
The corrupt king who started this whole mess to evade a prophecy.
Pelias's plotting perfectly mirrors a frequent Old Testament trope involving disobedient or pagan monarchs. Consider Pharaoh in the book of Exodus, who attempts to systematically eliminate the Hebrew infants to thwart Israel's prophesied deliverance and preserve his own workforce.
Right, trying to stop what God already declared.
Or King Saul in the book of 1 Samuel, who recognizes that God's prophetic favor has shifted to young David. Saul actively hunts David, or sends him into high-casualty battles with the Philistines, specifically to bypass his own prophetic rejection.
In all these cases, a king uses his institutional military power to try and kill the chosen leader in order to preserve his own crumbling throne.
And in both the classical epic and the biblical narrative, human schemes designed to trap the protagonist inadvertently function as the exact mechanism that brings the divine will to fruition.
The ultimate irony of mortal rebellion.
Pelias exiling Jason on this impossible quest is the very event that causes Jason to return with the magical fleece and the sorceress Medea, which directly leads to Pelias's gruesome death.
Wow.
Similarly, Saul's attempts to kill David only serve to increase David's military fame and solidify his right to the throne. Human efforts to subvert a divine decree inevitably accelerate its fulfillment.
But while the kings might act similarly, the sources point out a massive foundational contrast when it comes to the seer Phineas. We talked about Zeus torturing Phineas for revealing too much truth.
This is a profound theological divergence between the Greek and Hebrew worldviews. The great cosmic framework features a pantheon that is capricious, jealous, and fiercely protective of its knowledge.
They want humans to stay in the dark.
The gods are terrified that mortals might learn too much and disrupt the hierarchy. They want humanity structurally dependent and fumbling in the dark.
The Old Testament God operates completely differently in this regard.
Entirely differently. The Old Testament positions the prophet, the Hebrew word is nabi, not as a thief of divine secrets stealing fire from the gods, but as an authoritative, divinely mandated messenger.
Yeah.
Yahweh doesn't torture his prophets for speaking the truth. He actively commands them to make his will, his laws, and his future plans explicitly known to the covenant community. The biblical worldview is grounded in open, relational revelation, not cosmic secrecy.
Why do you think the Greek universe is so terrified of mortals knowing too much, while the Old Testament God actively seeks to broadcast his plans?
It comes down to fundamentally different definitions of sovereignty. The Greek gods are incredibly powerful, but they exist within a messy universe of competing forces, ancient fates, and constant trickery. Knowledge is a weapon that can be leveraged against them.
Okay, I see.
The Old Testament God is presented as the uncreated, transcendent creator, absolutely sovereign over all things. He doesn't fear human knowledge because human knowledge cannot possibly unseat him. He desires a covenantal relationship with humanity, and a genuine relationship requires transparent communication.
That structural difference makes so much sense. Now let's talk about the dove. Releasing a dove across an impassable watery boundary is literally the climax of Genesis 8 with Noah's Ark.
The imagery is a shared ancient Near Eastern motif. But again, the underlying worldviews regarding how humanity survives chaos are polarized.
Let's look at the mechanics of survival.
In the Argonautica, the crew survives the clashing rocks through a frantic synthesis of avian luck, extreme human physical exertion like rowing until their muscles tear, and Athena's localized physical shove. They have to actively manipulate their environment and fight through the chaos using every tool at their disposal.
And Noah, he doesn't have oars. He doesn't have a sail.
Noah remains entirely passive inside a sealed wooden box. He does not manipulate the environment. He relies on absolute, silent trust in a monotheistic covenant. In Genesis 8, the chaotic waters, the primordial deep, known as Tehom in Hebrew, are not subdued by human effort or localized goddess.
Right.
They are actively restrained and driven back by God's sovereign wind, his ruach.
So the Argo survives through a desperate mix of sweat, luck, and magic, while the Ark survives because God sovereignly restrains the primordial chaos on behalf of the passive believer.
Precisely. The dove returning to Noah with a freshly plucked olive leaf isn't a tactical test of a physical boundary like Phineas's dove. It is a structural, environmental sign that the death-dealing chaos has been safely subdued by divine mercy. Restoration in the biblical narrative is an act of God's grace, not human ingenuity.
And wrapping up the Old Testament parallels, the sources connect the shift away from Heracles, the solitary giant, to the specialized crew of the Argo to the Davidic narratives.
The shift away from a solitary mythic champion toward a highly integrated collaborative community is mirrored in Israel's history. Just as the Argo's success requires the diverse talents of the Argonauts rather than just Heracles, Israel's military security in 2 Samuel 23 shifts from David acting in total isolation, killing Goliath alone, to his reliance on elite, specialized warriors known as the Gibborim, or mighty men.
Both texts recognize that complex historical transitions demand a coordinated collective.
Exactly.
And this idea of a coordinated collective doesn't stop with David's mighty men. This brings us to the New Testament parallels, because this collaborative model arguably reaches its ultimate, most radical expression in the writings of the Apostle Paul.
Our dossier argues that the structural shift Apollonius makes in the Hellenistic era structurally anticipates the New Testament models of community, though with stark, vital ideological contrasts. The most striking parallel is between the catalog of heroes on the Argo and the Pauline theology of the Church as the body of Christ.
We established that Apollonius rejects the singular mega-hero in favor of a network of distinct specialized talents.
That structural emphasis strongly mirrors Paul's corporate framework in his letters, specifically in 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12. Paul mandates that the Christian community is one body. The Greek word he uses is soma, made up of many individual members.
Right.
And each member is endowed with unique, non-overlapping spiritual gifts called charismata, given specifically for the common good.
It is the exact same logic as assembling a crew for a ship. You don't want a church full of only preachers, just like you don't want a ship full of guys who only know how to hit things with clubs. You need the hands, the feet, the eyes, the ears.
As Paul vividly writes, the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. Both the Argonautica and the Pauline epistles completely reject individualistic boasting. The collective cannot function under a singular, dominating human leader who overshadows everyone else.
But the nature of that leadership and the meaning of weakness is where the two texts fiercely diverge, right? I mean, Jason is our leader on the Argo, and we've established he is anxious, vulnerable, and cries constantly. Our sources call this the subversion of the unshakable archaic hero.
Jason's tears subvert the old Homeric model, offering a layer of psychological realism. And this offers a poignant parallel to the New Testament's radical elevation of weakness.
Because Paul talks about boasting in his weakness.
Yes, Paul famously writes in 2 Corinthians that he boasts in his weaknesses, in his insults and hardships, so that Christ's power may rest upon him. And Christ himself exemplifies leadership through ultimate humility and submission to the brutality of the cross.
Both texts elevate a figure who appears weak to the outside world. But the sources argue the meaning of that weakness is totally different.
Crucially different. Jason's vulnerability represents the tragic limitation and paralyzing anxiety of the mortal condition. He weeps because he lacks control over a capricious, terrifying universe. He is weak because he is merely human.
And the New Testament reframes that weakness completely.
Christ submits to the cross, not out of anxious limitation, or because he lacks power to fight back, but as a deliberate, triumphant display of sovereign grace. Jason is a victim of his circumstances. Christ embraces human weakness to display ultimate cosmic authority over death itself.
That is a massive distinction in how a culture views suffering. Now, speaking of the New Testament, what about the boxing match? Polydeuces defeating the savage king Amycus. The sources connect this violent encounter directly to Paul's letters.
The ethical landscape of Book 2 engages directly with athletic metaphors that the New Testament later inherits and transforms. Polydeuces wins through disciplined training, defensive agility, and calculated restraint, overcoming the raw, chaotic, fleshly impulses of the giant Amycus.
He subdues the chaos with discipline.
This maps cleanly onto 1 Corinthians 9, where Paul employs intense boxing and athletic imagery. Paul writes that he does not box like one beating the air, which perfectly describes Amycus's blind, heavy, looping blows that miss their mark.
Yeah, just swinging wildly.
Instead, Paul says he disciplines his body and keeps it under strict control. The specific Greek word Paul uses is hypopiazo, which literally translates to strike beneath the eye, or to give a black eye, meaning to strictly physically subdue.
So Apollonius uses the boxing match to say, look how culturally superior and civilized Greeks are compared to savage barbarians. But Paul is weaponizing that exact same athletic metaphor for internal spiritual sanctification.
Apollonius champions physical and intellectual training for cultural supremacy. Paul demands spiritual self-control to resist moral corruption and sin. Paul notes that earthly athletes endure this brutal training to win a perishable wreath of leaves, like the crowns awarded at the Isthmian Games. But Christians endure spiritual discipline to win an imperishable crown.
I equate that perishable crown to modern corporate burnout. We are all running the race. We are all bruising our bodies, putting in 80-hour work weeks, neglecting our health and families. But are we doing it for a promotion or a quarterly bonus that will literally be forgotten in a year, a perishable crown? Or are we directing that immense discipline towards something eternal? It challenges the very target of our daily efforts.
That is a very apt pastoral application of the text. And it is fascinating to look at how the deep grammar of 1 Corinthians reinforces this theology of the body. The linguistic analysis in our dossier looks closely at 1 Corinthians 12, where Paul discusses how God arranged the individual members of the spiritual body.
Explain the grammar there. How does a verb tense explain theology?
Let's look at the contrast in tenses. When Paul described the ongoing lived exertion of the Christian life, running the race, subduing the body, fighting sin, he uses present tense verbs. This emphasizes a continuous, grinding, close-up, daily struggle.
Like saying, I am currently building this house and I am exhausted.
Exactly that. But when Paul describes the fundamental unity of the church and how God arranged the spiritual body with its diverse gifts, he switches abruptly to aorist tense verbs.
Aorist tense. What does that actually mean for a listener who doesn't speak ancient Greek?
Think of the aorist tense as describing an action that is a complete, finished package viewed from a distance. To use your analogy, it isn't I am building a house. It is simply the house was built. The action is definitive, foundational, and safely located in the past.
So by using the aorist tense for the unity of the church, Paul is saying that this unity isn't something humans are currently sweating and competing to build.
The unity of the church is an unshakable past act executed deliberately and perfectly by God. It completely eliminates human pride. You cannot boast about your specific spiritual gift because you didn't earn it in the present struggle. God definitively installed it in the remote past for his purposes.
It is a profound theological re-engineering of how a community structures its ego, which perfectly transitions us to the final major section of our dossier, the early church fathers' hijacking of the Argo. Knowing all these striking biblical parallels, how did the early Christians, who lived in a Greco-Roman world absolutely saturated with these pagan myths, actually respond to this wildly popular epic? They couldn't just ignore a story that everyone in their culture knew.
They didn't ignore it at all. The early church fathers employed a highly sophisticated two-pronged literary strategy, polemical subversion and pastoral appropriation.
What does that look like?
They fiercely attacked the idolatry embedded in the story, but they essentially stole the best metaphors for the gospel.
Let's talk about Clement of Alexandria.
Yeah.
The sources say he looked at the physical layout of the ship Argo and saw, well, the crucifixion.
Yes. In his writings, such as the Patrepticus and Stromata, Clement warns his readers against the epic's reliance on pagan sorcery. He notes that the Argonauts relied heavily on dark magic and incantations to survive their trials.
Right.
But then he makes this incredibly bold, imaginative, allegorical move. He argues that the physical geometry of a seafaring ship, specifically the intersection of its vertical wooden mast and its horizontal yards used to hold the sails, was a silent, prophetic, material performance of the crucifixion.
I have to push back on this. Isn't Clement stretching it just a bit here, looking at a piece of nautical equipment and saying, look, it's a cross? Is he just seeing what he desperately wants to see to make his theology fit the culture?
It is entirely fair for a modern reader to view that as aggressive proof texting or pareidolia, seeing patterns that aren't there. But to understand Clement, you have to understand the ancient and patristic mindset. They believed the material world was deeply imbued with divine geometry and prophetic shadows.
Meaning the physical shape of things had actual spiritual significance.
To Clement, the cross wasn't just a brutal historical event that happened on a Friday in Jerusalem. It was the fundamental, sustaining structure of the entire cosmos. So, of course, the only way a ship could safely navigate the chaotic, death-dealing sea was if its very wood mimicked the cruciform shape of Christ's cross. It was structural necessity.
Wow. He is saying the classical epics grasped at shadows of true safety, but the church is the true Argo, and the cross is its true mast, guiding believers to eternal rest with Christ functioning as the sovereign pilot.
He naturalizes the interdependence of Apollonius' specialized crew into the pastoral reality of the Christian body navigating the storms of a hostile world.
What about the other fathers? The dossier mentions Tertullian and Hippolytus.
They use these popular myths for severe pastoral correction. Tertullian looked at the moralized athletic contests, like Polydeuces utilizing extreme discipline to box the giant Amycus, and used it to shame lazy or compromising Christians.
So using their own myths against them.
He essentially argued, if pagan athletes can endure such grueling, bruising, bloody training just to win a temporary wreath of leaves, Christians must show infinitely deeper self-control for the eternal kingdom of God. He used the rigor of the classical hero as a baseline to validate and elevate Pauline athletic metaphors.
And Hippolytus, how did he use the maritime imagery?
Hippolytus framed dangerous mythical sea voyages as metaphors for the deceptive traps of heretical belief systems. He contrasted the volatile, intellectually unstable ships of human philosophy and pagan navigation with the unshakable, storm-proof ark of Orthodox faith.
They basically took the blockbuster pop culture of their day, stripped out the pagan theology, and used the epic imagery to teach Christian orthodoxy. It is a brilliant cultural strategy.
There's a vital cultural battleground. The fathers appreciated the epic's rejection of raw, individualistic force in favor of community, but they fiercely critiqued the tragic helplessness of Jason. To the patristic mind, Jason's paralyzing anxiety and reliance on magic represented the ultimate bankruptcy of pagan heroism under the weight of a fallen world.
Because he couldn't actually save himself.
Right. True power, for the early church, wasn't found in anxious mortal survival, but in the triumphant humility of Christ.
Which brings us to the end of this incredible journey today. Let's synthesize what we've unpacked in this deep dive. By reading the Argonautica alongside its linguistic architecture, the Hebrew scriptures, and the early church fathers, we gain this brilliant, multifaceted mirror. On one hand, it exposes the exhausting futility of human autonomy, like King Peleus trying to build political schemes to outsmart a divine decree, only to bring about his own violent doom.
And it highlights the tragedy of relying solely on human strategy, perfectly embodied in Jason's paralyzing anxiety as he faces a capricious, terrifying universe he cannot control.
But on the other hand, it prepares our minds to appreciate the divine design of interdependent community. The shift from Heracles ripping up trees by himself to the specialized, diverse crew of the Argo is a cultural stepping stone to understanding the Church as the interconnected body of Christ. And Polydeuces' disciplined victory over the savage giant is a lasting reminder of the absolute necessity of internal discipline and self-control when facing the chaos of the world.
It is a profound text that captures humanity's deep-seated, enduring longing for cosmic order, cooperative deliverance, and a permanent solution to the crippling fragility of the human condition.
To you listening right now, we live in a world that still oscillates wildly between these ancient extremes. We still worship the solitary brute force hero, the billionaire saviors, the lone wolf tech innovators who promise to fix everything themselves, while simultaneously many of us feel completely paralyzed by anxiety in the face of uncontrollable global chaos, just like Jason weeping on the beach.
It's very relatable.
What this deep dive shows us is that true safety isn't found in a magic dove or a pagan ritual, or in pretending you have the strength to row the ship all by yourself. True safety is found in anchoring to a sovereign pilot and embracing the specialized, deeply interdependent community you were designed for.
Which leaves us with a fascinating trajectory to consider for the future of our own stories.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. We saw how Apollonius shifted the idea of heroism from the lone warrior with a club to the cooperative technical crew navigating a ship. Then the early church shifted it again from a pragmatic crew just trying to survive the sea to the spiritually unified internal body of Christ. It is a continuous evolution of what it means to be a hero and a community. So, what is the next evolution of heroism in our modern era? We live in an increasingly fragmented, hyper-individualized, AI-driven digital world where isolation is the norm. Are we reverting back to the myth of the isolated, self-reliant hero, sitting alone behind a screen in a dark room, imagining we can conquer the world's problems with brute force computing and zero human contact? Or are we being called to build a completely new kind of Argo, one where true vulnerability, deep empathy, and real-world, face-to-face interdependence are the ultimate rebellion against the digital chaos? Because maybe, just maybe, the lone wolf was always a myth, and the real epic adventure is figuring out how to row together. Until next time, keep diving deep.